All right, Kindred, what's going on? I'm so glad to see you guys. My name's Zach. If I haven't met you, I would love to be able to do that tonight. I'm so thrilled that you're here tonight for our ongoing study of this book called Genesis. I ran into somebody this week that I hadn't seen in a long time, and they told me they've been listening to our sermons on podcasts, but they hadn't made it yet because of COVID or whatever else is going on in their life. And they said, I think I might try to go soon. Who's preaching this week? And I said, well, I am, and this person I knew, so I was thinking this is going to go well. And they said to me, when's Lindsay up next? So, sorry, guys, here I am. I'm thrilled to be with you. We are tracing every significant moment of the book of Genesis. So we have only skipped things like genealogies with a bunch of names I can't pronounce, and we're going after the big ideas to make sure that we get this study of Genesis for all that it's worth. So Genesis, we've been looking at Abraham for quite a bit of time now. And tonight we pick up where we left off last week. If you missed last week, we looked at a story, and part of that story was God showing up and telling Abraham and Sarah in their very advanced age that at this time next year, God would return and they would have a baby. So if you missed that or you don't know that story, Sarah laughed because she found it to be absolutely ludicrous. And we looked at a few reasons for that last week. And here's how Genesis 21 starts off. It says this. Now, the Lord was gracious to Sarah, as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah what he had promised. Sarah became pregnant and bore a son to Abraham in his old age, at the very time that God had promised him. Abraham gave this name Isaac to his son that Sarah bore him. So Abraham, it tells us, was 100 years old when Isaac is born, and Sarah is 90 years old. So the idea of having a baby made Sarah laugh at God. The name Isaac means laughter. So they named this baby Laughter, and she remarks this right after his birth. She says, God has brought me laughter, and everyone who hears about this will laugh with me. I think it maybe should have said at me, but it says will laugh with me, right? So here they are, 190 with this newborn baby. And I think last week we looked at how Sarah was laughing and she had some bitterness behind her laugh. But this week, this lesson, this laugh is turned to one of joy. And it makes sense that it would, right? Anytime any of us are living in the immediate aftermath of seeing a promise that God gave us or something that we've been hoping and praying for come true, things are really good, right? Joy is present. And sometimes it's only for a moment and sometimes it sustains. But we know this that life is really long and life can be really difficult. And so these wins are important. These times that we see God do the thing that we hoped he would or the thing that we think he promised is a huge deal. And when we take stock of our lives and the things that really matter, it's moments like this. I did 2 funerals this week for people that I care about, for families that I really care about. And the stories that get shared at funerals are these kinds of stories. They're stories about relationship, about family, about friends, about good times together, right? They're not stories that highlight the things that the world tells us are important. And, some of these things are still semi-important, but the world tells us the most important things are stuff like the next big payday, right? No funeral I've ever been to talks about how much money the person had, right? That'd be a sad funeral, right? The funerals that I go to talk about who the person was. And nobody ever shows a Facebook post up there and says, this is the time that they totally owned the people that were arguing with them on Facebook, and that was an amazing moment for their life, right? These aren't the things that we remember or that we hold on to, right? When I'm doing well in my own following of Jesus, so for those of us that in the room that call ourselves Jesus followers, I know that the case that the things that are really important to me are the things that are about family and friends and my faith, right? Unfortunately, this is true for us, and it was true for Abraham and Sarah, that we don't stay focused on those blessings and those wins long enough. Even when we're enjoying them, we can see things quickly turn, and we see this in this story as well. Sarah, in the very next paragraph, is told that she's celebrating what is called the weaning of Isaac. It's a funny word, but it basically means this: Isaac's done with being a baby. So we know that this happens about 2 to 5 years later, and the snap of a finger, the very next sentence, advances us 5 years. Sarah's about 95, Abraham's about 105. And in that 5 years, we know this, any parent knows, that those years with a child are fun and really funny, and also so difficult, right? So we have this 95-year-old, this 105-year-old that had been chasing this little toddler. And a second thing happens as they're doing this. Sarah's watching Isaac grow up into this cute little toddler, but she's also watching Abraham's other son that we saw Lindsay teach about a few weeks ago, Ishmael, grow up right alongside him. Now, a few things are going on here, and I'm going to explain this a little bit for those of you who don't know the story or missed that week. But Sarah's being reminded of a few things. One, she's being reminded that she and Abraham had together panicked when they couldn't have a son, and had come up with this kind of wild plan for them to have a kid through this woman that worked for them. So they took this plan outside of God's agreement with them. We've been tracing these things called covenants that are agreements God makes with people in the Bible that says certain things will happen in certain ways. You have something to uphold, and God has something to uphold. And this specific covenant with Abraham and Sarah, God had said, I will bless your family. You will be a blessing to the entire earth. The entire line of the world will follow from you. Your descendants will be like stars in the sky, but I need you to continue to follow after me and to have the kind of faith that I've asked you to have. So Sarah's being reminded in Ishmael of her own sin in making that decision. She sees that loud and clear in front of her every single day. And it's also a really reminder, like a plain reminder, a human reminder, that son, that kid, was her husband's with another woman, right? So she was resentful, and she finally has enough. And we see what the thing that, like the straw that breaks the camel's back, is that she sees Ishmael making fun of Isaac. Maybe he found out the kid's name was Laughter. I don't know what's going on there, but he's picking on him. And she looks at Abraham and says this. She says, get rid of that slave woman and her son. For that woman's son will never share in the inheritance with my son, Isaac. So honestly, I'm reading this, and I think in a way it's totally understandable how Sarah feels, right? It's a rough way that she feels, but it's understandable. From her point of view, I think we can kind of understand easily what she's going through. But you think about Abraham. Abraham has his son Ishmael. He's got to love the kid, right? This is his son. It's technically his oldest son, and we're going to see some things that the Genesis account does with language around this in a minute. But this is his oldest son. Abraham now has a decision to make about this kid. Sarah wants him to cast him off, which is really, the decision is this. Sending them away would pretty much almost certainly be a death sentence for both of them. They would be vulnerable, they'd be homeless, they'd be wandering, they would have really nowhere to turn. So Abraham has to make the decision, will I do that to my own son? And ultimately, under Sarah's pressure and his own decision making, he does send them away. He does what Sarah asks. He says, that's my wife, that's the life that I choose, and he casts them away. So Hagar and Ishmael are in the desert, and they nearly die, but they're saved in this kind of dramatic moment with an angel, like we keep seeing in Genesis. And the angel makes this promise to both to Hagar and to Ishmael, and it's a parallel promise to the same agreement, the same covenant that Abraham's living in. And this is what the angel says. The angel says, lift the boy up, take him by the hand, for I will make him into a great nation. So it's the same promise that Abraham has received, that through Isaac, God will bless the entire world. He's now saying, I will do something similar with Ishmael. And something bigger than that we see is, if you think back 2 weeks ago when Lindsay taught about this story of Hagar and Ishmael, is we see again in this moment that God hears Hagar's cries for help. He sees her distress, and he shows up again in the worst of times to deliver her from something really, truly terrible. And again, we see this. Abraham and Sarah, even though they've been chosen for this covenant, this agreement with God, they're imperfect people, right? They're far from making every good decision, but they still remain in this blessing and in this covenant, in this agreement that God has promised them. So this section about Ishmael, about a choice that Abraham has to make about his son, is a prelude to one of the most famous sections of the entire book of Genesis, which is what we're going to kind of focus on the rest of our time tonight. It's in chapter 22, and it's a passage that's titled Abraham Tested. Now, some of you probably know this story, so you know what we're about to look at tonight. Maybe you feel bad for me. I hope you do. and I will tell you this. I've been a Christian for a couple decades now, and every time I read the passage that we're going to look at tonight, historically, every time I've ever thought about it, looked at it, I'm bothered, greatly bothered. It's a tough thing to read. I will tell you this is a spoiler alert. As I studied it and looked at it this week, I'm actually encouraged by it, and I hope that hopefully what I accomplished tonight is giving you some of that encouragement as well. Here's how the story goes. God says to him, take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you. Now, if you've never heard this before and you're like, let's get out of this weird place, hang on for a second. It's a brutal start to the story, but there's so much going on in it, and I want to unpack it with you. First is this. God's identifying to Abraham who he is to take on this journey that he's called him to. If you notice the language in there, he says 4 different ways who he wants Abraham to take on this journey with him. So he says, take your son, okay? And then he says, your only son. And it's probable that what he's doing there is reminding Abraham, remember you got rid of the other one, right? And he says, whom you love. And again, he clarifies one more time and says, Isaac. It's Isaac, not Ishmael. I'm telling you, please take specifically the one that you still have. It's a pretty powerful thing that he has to say, differentiate it 4 different ways who he's talking about. So it seems like maybe he's reminding him, remember that hole in your heart? Remember that thing that you did? Remember that pain that you're holding? Well, I want you to remember that as I call you to do this thing that had to have sounded crazy. Crazy. He's setting us up for another thing too. How much Isaac is truly loved by Abraham. It has to burn in Abraham's heart as he hears it. So God's asked him to do this thing that's honestly really horrible for every single one of us to think about. And so I want to spend the rest of our time trying to make sense of what's going on in this passage. So importantly, this sentence structure that God has just spoken to Abraham in, it basically completely matches the call of Abram all the way back in chapter 12, if you were here for that. What that is it's when God first encounters Abram and tells him, I want you to leave everything that you have, and I want you to go to a place that I will show you. And so this chapter in 22 is basically the same thing. He's instructed to leave the comfort of his home, to go to the place that he doesn't even know where it is, and to blindly believe in the instruction of this voice. And in Genesis 12, he encounters this voice for the very first time. It's a brand new voice to him. But by chapter 22, our story tonight, Abraham trusted this voice. So he wakes up the next morning, he gets his things together, including his son Isaac, whom he loves, and they set off. And as they get close to this place that God's identified, Abraham tells his servants, stay back, and he sends them away, and he takes Isaac to hike up this mountain. We're told this. Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. So here's what we know about what's going on here. So if you're like me, maybe the thing that's always burned in my memory of this story is like Renaissance paintings, right? Of Isaac as a baby on this altar, and there's maybe some kind of crazy like angel in the sky and like lightning coming down. And so I always had that picture in my head, but here's what we know already just by reading this. Isaac is much older than that. And we've already been told that he weaned off of his mother, so we know he's at least 5 at that point. And then we get this line. It's a literary device that's used in Genesis that says this, sometime later, God tested Abraham. So that sometime later, we don't know exactly how long that is, right? And then following this story that we're looking at tonight to kick off chapter 23, we get, again, the word sometime later, and we find out that Sarah is 127 years old. So between Genesis 21 and Genesis 23, we know 37 years or so passes. But we don't know where this is. What do the politicians call that? Fuzzy math. So I'm going to do a little fuzzy math, and we know this. Isaac is almost certainly at least a teenager. Like some people think he was 15, maybe 18. Some people think he was as old as 37. So when we look at this story, what we're looking at is not a story about a dad taking his baby to sacrifice him. We're looking at, and not that it's a lot better, but we're looking at a story of a man with his child traveling on this journey. His young adult, his young man. So with that fuzzy math and that understanding, we just know he's not a baby. We also know this. Abraham has been living, and we saw this last week, we see it again this week, in a land called Canaan. And in Canaan, they actually do sacrifice people, like their babies. So he's living in this, and remember, if you remember last week, he's an alien, a stranger, a foreigner in this land. He's living among people who have no problem doing this. He's living among people who do this regularly. Now, all around the world, throughout history, we see evidence that most cultures did this at some point. But specifically in the Old Testament, we see commands again and again that say not to do this. That God is a God who hates child sacrifice. God is a God who is against the practice of the Canaanites as they sacrificed their children to this god called Moloch that they worshipped. So we know this. Abraham would have detested this practice. Right? Isaac's older than a baby, and we know this. The two of them are on a journey together. And in any case, as they walk, we see further evidence of Isaac's age by this conversation that they have. says this, Isaac spoke up and said to his father, Abraham, Father? Yes, my son, Abraham replied. The fire and the wood are here, Isaac said, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? Abraham answered, God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. And the two of them went on together. So what they're up to here wouldn't have appeared strange to Isaac because the practice of sacrificing an animal to atone for sin was very common, right? And so Isaac probably thinks he's just on some journey to help his dad do this, and he asks his dad, well, where is the animal that we're going to sacrifice? But more than that, I want to ask you, can you feel the tenderness in the conversation that they're having? I mean, they're referring to each other in these familial relationship names, these terms of endearment, right? Accenting this for us. This father that waited for years and years for this son. It was everything that he wanted. It's everything that he ever dreamed of. And now he's hearing him call out to him, and it had to be extremely painful for him to hear those words. Which leads me to this kind of sidebar conversation that I want to have for a minute. There's a couple obvious questions that I have just from what we've read in this story so far. And there's a lot more of them, but probably the two questions that I ask the most when I read this are these. Number one, why would God ask Abraham to do this? Like if he's testing his faith, which is the answer for most people, why this test? Why is it this? And the second question is this, why in the world would Abraham agree to it, right? I want to look at number two first. We know this, Abraham is 100 and at least 5 years old, and probably more than that. And Sarah's in her mid-90s, probably getting close to 100. They have this literal joy of Isaac brought into their lives that brings them joy and laughter. And then God's telling Abraham that he requires this sacrifice now after all of this. So when we study this passage, there's a few possibilities of why in the world Abraham would say yes to this action. So bear with me, I have four possibilities. The first one's this. It might be that just like we've studied over the last month, that Abraham is just that obedient. Now, we've been talking about his unusual obedience, how he's a man who follows after the words of God like nobody else. So maybe what we're seeing here is that he's just saying, if God said it, I'm going to do it, right? It set him apart to be God's choice to have the entire world follow after him. Maybe this is just more proof, although a strange one, of that concept. Right? Second possibility is this. Maybe Abraham simply knew, he had faith that Isaac wouldn't die. And maybe it's because he knows it goes against the character of God. He knows God's not like that. Or maybe it's because he has heard these commands going all the way back to Cain and Abel that we don't spill human blood. Maybe he knows at some point that God is going to do something to change this situation. And I think that's a strong contender for what Abraham was up to. The third thing that I thought of this week is this. He might have recognized that all the livestock that he raised, every firstborn was sacrificed. And so maybe somewhere in Abraham's head when he heard this, he had this idea that maybe God was calling him to do something like that. Now again, he lived amongst these people, the Canaanites, who around him were doing these practices of their child sacrifices, and maybe it just distorted his view of what was going on. Now, in order for this to be true, it would mean this. It would mean that Abraham had made some compromises and some bad ideas, and that he would have what we call a syncretic faith, a mixed ideology of what he really believes about God. This one is very far-fetched, and I think, honestly, when I was writing this, I had 2 Americanos, and I was feeling pretty crazy. So let's go ahead and throw that one out. The last one, and this is the one that I really believe is probably what's going on here. My vote goes to this. Abraham doesn't know he's in a test, right? He just thinks that he's doing what God asked him to do. And so that kind of faith and that kind of trust that Abraham has displayed over this last month of our study is present again. And it makes me think this. It makes me think that when he tells Isaac, God himself will provide the lamb, that he meant it, that he actually really believed that. We also see this. Abraham has this relationship with God that is really different than pretty much everybody else's that I've ever seen. Last week, if he weren't here, he argues with God face to face about a plan God has to destroy a sinful place. He advocates for people that he doesn't know to the living God. God shows up in the flesh as this big moment where he has a face-to-face conversation with him. And more than that, Abraham hears a voice of God clearly and acts on it very decisively in a way that I've never have personally, right? So a lot of scholars, and a couple that I read this week, have asked this question. What if, along with God testing Abraham, what if Abraham is actually sort of testing God as well? That's what I mean by that. He certainly has faith and trust. He certainly believes that this covenant agreement, that the entire world is going to run through his line, and through the line specifically of Isaac, is a true promise. And so if Abraham believes that, he also has to believe that God has to be a liar if Isaac is killed. And so Abraham has to be wondering, if this promise is still true, if this agreement is still in play, what happens when I take Isaac to this hill? I think he takes Isaac not as a sacrifice, but as an offering, saying, here's my son, show me what you have next. To let him know, God, I'm still in on this agreement. Are you? Are you still going to make good on this promise that you've given me? I really believe that's what's happening, and this is what happens next in the story. It says, when they reached the place that God had told them about, Abraham built an altar there, and he arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac, and he laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then he reached out his hand, and he took the knife to slay his son. It's disturbing, right? But listen, Isaac, as we've seen, is certainly old enough that he could take a 105-year-old dude if he wanted to, okay? So I was reading this week through those eyes. Like, I'm of what they call weak genetic stock. I'm going to fight a 105-year-old. I'm going to win, okay? So Isaac, somewhere between 15 and 37, is certainly able, if he wanted to resist Abraham in this moment. I never really thought about it until recently. I think what we're looking at here is this. I think this story is as much about the willingness and the faith and the trust of Isaac as it is about anything else. Now, some of that faith and that trust is in his dad. And in this case, not going well at this moment, right? And I think some of us in this room know what that's like. We know what it's like to trust somebody like that so much and be burned, right? But a lot of this faith and this trust and his willingness in this moment is because Isaac has a strong relationship with God the Father as well. And he trusts that God is going to do something, that God is going to show up. And it's an interesting thing that in these stories in Genesis, a lot of times we have a Christian view of it, we have a Jewish view of it, and a lot of these stories we actually have a Muslim view of it. Abraham is the father of all three of those faiths. And so this story from Genesis is read by Christians and Jews slightly different. But in the Quran, the story of Abraham on the mountainside actually takes place with Ishmael, which is interesting. So what happens with the story of Ishmael in the Quran is he goes and he tells Ishmael, God has told me to kill you. And Ishmael says to him, who am I to tell the Lord what to do? Let's go together. Now, I believe that they got the story wrong, right? As God has shown us here, it's Isaac on the mountainside with Abraham, but I do think that what we see with Isaac is a very similar willingness, a very similar posture towards God. And I think it's absolutely remarkable to think about. Abraham has to be in this moment as his son lies on this altar where he wonders, God, where are you showing up and what are you going to do next? How are we going to get out of this? And luckily he doesn't have to wait for long because this is what happens next. It says, the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, Abraham, Abraham. Here I am, he replied. That here I am is a very reverent answer from Abraham, a very calm and reverent answer. It says, do not lay a hand on the boy, he said. Do not do anything to him. Now that I know that you fear God, I'm going to come back to this word fear in a moment, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son. Abraham looked up, and there in the thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. He went over and he took the ram, and he sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called that place, the Lord will provide. Now, there's a very interesting thing that's going on here in this passage with this Hebrew word that they used for the word looked. Would you throw that back up there real fast? So when it says Abraham looked up, this word looked is the same exact Hebrew word that's been used two other times in this passage. It's been used for the word provide when Abraham looks at his son and says, God will provide the lamb. It's the same word. And it's used for the word saw when Abraham looks and sees the place that he's supposed to go and take Isaac to, right? All three of this word is ra'ah, which means to see. And it means to see, but it also means to see both literally or figuratively. And so this word unlocks this passage, I think, in a really powerful way, because this is what we're saying. It's saying that Abraham saw the mountain that he was supposed to go to, but he envisioned this sacrifice to be provided. And then again, he saw this ram that was given in place of Isaac. So Abraham isn't just guessing at God's goodness, right? Or he's not even simply just hoping for God's goodness. He's confident in it. He's confident that his reward is going to be a reaffirmation of this covenant agreement from God, and that God is going to show up and do something in place of Isaac that we can only begin to imagine. So it seems at this point in the story that both God and Abraham have possibly passed this test that they laid for one another. This is what it tells us next. It says, the angel of the Lord called to Abraham from heaven a second time and said, I swear by myself, it's a weird statement, declares the Lord, that because you have done this and not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies, and through your offspring, all nations on earth will be blessed because you have obeyed me. It's the promise again. He brings back the same agreement, the same covenant, the same promise. And maybe this is the place where we see the answer to the first question that I asked, which is what God's reason for this test is. And God wants to see something. He wants to see what kind of idol that Abraham has made Isaac in his life. He wants to see if he's more important to him than God himself. Now, again, as I keep reiterating through this study, God knew. God already knew the outcome of this. He knew what he was going to encounter. And so the test, I would argue, is actually for Abraham's benefit, as strange as that might sound at the end of it. One author I read this week, he makes the point like this. He said, a potter doesn't test defective jars. They would break. He only tests the sound ones. God doesn't give us tests that are designed for us to fail, right? That's what bad teachers do. I had a few of those in college, right? We've all had bad teachers. They want you to fail. God is a good teacher. He's a perfect teacher. And so what we know is this. God knew that Abraham was sound, and Abraham discovers that God is safe. It says this. It says that he fears him. Now, if you don't know the Hebrew word that as you unpack it and translate it, it means that he reveres him. It means that he has reverent respect for God. And so this is important because as we look back on this story thousands of years later and look at lessons that it teaches us, here's what I keep coming back to. Our trials, our tribulations, the things that we go through, they aren't all designed as tests, but they test us. They certainly do test us. But it'd be a bad application of this story to assume that God's tripping us up all throughout our lives. That every time something bad happens, that he's after us again. And I know people who live that way. A good application is this, to look into our own hearts, to look into the things that we allow to become bigger than God and the things that we know we need to remove as a result because they're stopping us from experiencing him like we could. It's often a simple mindset shift, or it's an attitude adjustment, or it's turning and changing and doing something new. But it's always understanding that we're stronger than we think we are. That as we move towards being sound jars and not fragile ones. And maybe most importantly is this, to know that Jesus himself is our answer. That no matter what comes up in our life and no matter what we experience and no matter what we go through, that he's always with us. And that when our trust and our faith is placed in him, even when it feels like we're failing, even when it feels like nothing's going to get better, even when it feels like the darkest day is here, that Jesus is right there with us, advocating for us to God all the time. This story of Abraham and Isaac, it has much greater purpose and meaning the longer we read and study the Bible. Several stories that follow that we're going to see along our study of the Bible call back to this story. And like I keep saying in our study of Genesis, every single story points to Jesus. And this one really does, right? Some of it's pretty obvious, but as Abraham is called to give his only son and sacrifice for sin on the altar, God would ultimately act on humanity's behalf this same way through Jesus, but God goes through with it, right? As Isaac carried this wood for his own altar up a mountainside, Abraham thinking that he's sacrificing him, Jesus would drag his cross up to Calvary and be sacrificed. As Jesus defeats death and resurrects from the dead, Isaac, as good as dead in one moment, is given a new lease on life, and then so are we. And we can exercise then faith, confidence in what we hope for, and assurance about what we do not see. And then this is the cool part. That promise that Abraham gets, that covenant, that God will make his descendants like stars in the sky, is us. All these thousands of years later, across space and time, we are those stars. And we see this come up in the book of Philippians. The writer Paul, he picks this promise up about the descendants of Abraham and that the heirs of his kind of faith. And he says this, he says, "My dear friends, as you have always obeyed, continue to work out your salvation with fear." It's that same word, reverence to God and trembling. For it is God who works in you to will you and to act in order to fulfill his good purpose. Do everything without grumbling or arguing, so that you may become blameless and pure, children of God, without fault in a warped and crooked generation. And he says this, "Then you will shine among them like stars in the sky as you hold firmly to the word of life." We know this, Jesus does all of the work for us. Jesus takes all of the burden from us. Jesus passes every single test on our behalf and advocates us for us in front of God. He stands in our place and he justifies us to God. And then we get to shine like stars in the darkness around us. We get to show the people in life how good Jesus really is by being more like him and showing the world that he's good. Let's pray together. God, I thank you for a story like this one that is difficult because it teaches me again and again how good you are. God, that the things that we see at face value are never really the thing that you're doing. God, the things that I expect from you, you always do something better. And so God, in this story, as I'm reminded that you placed this man of great faith, this man of great reverence to you, that as you helped him experience this promise again and again, that as he follows you and makes you the most important thing in his life, that you would continue to bless him. God, I pray that for me and my friends in this room tonight, that we'd be able to look at that in our own lives and ask you to again show up, to again bring us that joy and that laughter that comes with one of your promises being fulfilled. And for us to continue to turn our hearts and our minds and our lives towards you, not for better behavior, but for better blessing from you, to be more like you, to continue to follow after you, and to continue to shine to the world that's full of darkness, to show them that you are really a good God that has so much better in store for us. So thank you for Jesus. We pray this in his name. Amen.